My ex-husband's mother gave a sneer. She's only present to humiliate herself. Yet as I trailed my ex inside the courtroom, the judge abruptly paused. He inclined towards the court clerk, his tone quivering. Why had nobody informed me she was present? The deep silence that ensued conveyed everything. My ex-husband thought he'd absolutely buried me. For 3 years, he'd systematically dismantled my life, stolen my sister, and tried to paint me as unstable, vindictive, and completely unfit. But the day I, Clara Monroe, walked into that courtroom, just as his expensive lawyers were smirking, the judge presiding over my case froze. His hand trembled as he leaned over to his clerk and whispered, "Why didn't anyone tell me she was here?" Yeah, you heard that right. She. What Ethan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't spent those 3 years crumbling. I'd spent them quietly, painstakingly, building something he never could, a fortress made of truth. And today, his empire of lies was about to come crashing down. I stood outside that courthouse that morning, the October sunlight glinting off the granite steps. It felt too bright, too normal, for what was about to unfold. My hands were steady, though, fingers curled loosely around my bag strap. Over the past 3 years, I'd learned that stillness could be a weapon, that silence could speak louder than any scream. That's when I saw him. Ethan Hale, my ex-husband, walked up those steps like he owned them. He was flanked by his silver-haired, impeccably suited lawyer, a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and his mother, Margaret, pearls gleaming, an expression of smug certainty plastered across her face. Ethan's laugh carried across the crisp morning air, sharp and cruel. It was the same laugh I'd heard 1,000 times during our marriage, a victory cry when he thought he'd won something. He caught sight of me and leaned into his lawyer, his voice just loud enough for me to hear. "Look at her. Pathetic. She actually thinks she has a chance." I didn't flinch. I stopped flinching about 2 years ago. What Ethan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this wasn't just about our failed marriage anymore. This wasn't about splitting assets or settling scores. No, this trial was about Leah, my 15-year-old sister. The girl I'd raised since our parents died in a car accident when she was 7. The girl Ethan had tried to take from me by convincing a court I was mentally unstable, unfit, and dangerous. He'd painted me as the villain in his meticulously crafted story, the obsessive ex-wife, the unhinged woman who just couldn't let go. But I'd been painting my own picture, stroke by careful stroke, for 3 long years. And today, the canvas would finally be revealed. Inside my mind, I could see Leah's face from this morning, hopeful and terrified in equal measure. Her dark hair pulled back, her hands gripping mine as she promised to be brave. I'd told her to stay home, that she didn't need to see this, but she'd insisted on being nearby, waiting at a cafe 2 blocks away with my best friend, Ava. "You can't protect me from everything, Clara," she'd said. And the truth of it had broken something in my chest. I'd been trying to protect her from Ethan since the day I realized what he truly was. The memories surfaced, unbidden. Ethan during our marriage, all charm and calculated affection. He'd isolated me so gradually, so subtly, that I hadn't even noticed until I was completely alone. First, it was suggesting I didn't need to see my college friends so often. Then, questioning why I needed my own bank account when we were building a life together. Then the subtle comments about my work, my decisions, my thoughts, always delivered with that disarming smile that made me question whether I was just being too sensitive. When our parents died and Leah came to live with us, I actually thought she might soften him. Instead, she became another tool for his control. "She needs stability," he'd said. "Consistency. Maybe you shouldn't work so late. Maybe you're not giving her enough attention." I doubted myself constantly, wondering if he was right, if I was failing Leah the way he suggested. It took me 2 agonizing years to realize that the doubt itself was his creation. "Clara," Ava's voice pulled me back to the present. She stood beside me now, her warm brown eyes steady and reassuring. As a paralegal, she knew courtrooms the way I knew blueprints. Every angle, every structural weakness. "You ready?" she asked softly. I nodded, but she saw right through it. "You have something they don't," she whispered. "Truth. And him." My throat tightened. I knew who she meant. Edward Langston, retired federal judge. The man who'd believed me when no one else would. Who'd taught me that justice wasn't about volume, but about precision. He'd told me he'd be here today, watching from the gallery, a silent presence that would change everything. But I didn't say his name aloud, not yet. We walked into the courthouse through security, down the marble hallway that smelled of floor polish and old paper. Ethan's lawyer, Harrison Burke, stood near the courtroom doors, chest puffed out, speaking loudly to a cluster of colleagues. Judge Weston always sides with families of reputation, he bragged, glancing our way with barely concealed contempt. This will be over before lunch. I kept my gaze low, my expression neutral. Let him think I was afraid. Let them all think I was the broken woman Ethan had described in his filings. I knew something they didn't. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy, laden with wood and formality. I took my seat beside Michael Trent, my attorney. He was a quiet man in his 40s with sharp eyes and an understated demeanor that people often mistook for timidity. It was his greatest advantage. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Daniel Weston entered. A man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for strictness tempered by fairness. Or so everyone said. I'd done my research. Weston favored stability and wealth, often ruling in favor of established families over struggling individuals. Ethan's side had counted on that. The proceedings began with Ethan's testimony. He sat in the witness box looking earnest and wounded, his voice trembling at all the right moments as he described our marriage. I tried to help her, he said, eyes glistening. After her parents died, Clara changed. She became paranoid, accusatory. She disappeared for hours without explanation. I worried about Laya's safety, about what Clara might do during one of her episodes. Episodes. The word made my jaw clench. There had been no episodes. There had been late nights gathering evidence, meeting with Edward, building the case that would free both Leia and myself from Ethan's web. His lawyer presented doctored photographs, me looking disheveled in one, angry in another, all taken out of context and presented as proof of instability. Emails I'd written were twisted, words cherry-picked to make me seem obsessive. The gallery murmured sympathetically. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, playing the concerned grandmother to perfection. I sat perfectly still, watching it all unfold. When Michael stood to cross-examine, he did something unexpected. He asked for a brief recess before presenting our case. Harrison Burke shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is stalling. But Judge Weston, perhaps sensing the unusual nature of Michael's request, allowed it. During the recess, Margaret leaned toward Harrison, her voice dripping with disdain. What's she waiting for? A miracle. I turned slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. The words came out calm, quiet, certain. No, I'm waiting for him to arrive. The confusion on her face was almost worth 3 years of suffering. Almost. The black sedan pulled up outside the courthouse at exactly 10:43 a.m. I knew because I'd been watching the clock, counting down the minutes until Edward Langston would walk through those doors and change everything. Inside the courtroom, the recess had ended, and Ethan was back on the stand, spinning his narrative with renewed confidence. He described a night I'd supposedly thrown dishes during an argument, how Laya had cowered in her room, terrified. It was complete fiction, but he told it with such conviction that I saw Judge Weston lean forward, concerned. I had no choice but to document everything, Ethan continued, for Laya's protection. I have videos, recordings, witnesses who can confirm Clara's erratic behavior. My stomach twisted, but I kept my face blank. Michael had warned me about this. Ethan would try to bury me in manufactured evidence, hoping I'd crack under the pressure. But I'd been preparing for 3 years. I knew how to breathe through the lies. Judge Weston was listening intently, his expression grave. His reputation had preceded him. Strict but fair, they said. Though I'd learned he had a tendency to favor families with established wealth and social standing. The Hales fit that description perfectly. Old money, community ties, charitable foundations that bore their name. I was just Clara Monroe, the architect who'd lost her professional reputation when Ethan framed me for his crimes. The unstable widow who couldn't hold her life together after tragedy. That was the story everyone knew. But stories I knew could be rewritten. Michael stood, adjusting his glasses in that careful way he had. Your Honor, the defense would like to call an additional advisor to review the evidence before cross-examination. Harrison Burke exploded out of his seat. That's highly irregular, Your Honor. The witness list was submitted weeks ago. This is ambush tactics. Judge Weston frowned, but after a moment's consideration, he nodded slowly. I'll allow it, but Mr. Trent, this is the only irregularity I'm permitting today. Understood, Your Honor. The courtroom doors opened. I didn't turn around immediately. I wanted to savor this moment, the last seconds before everything shifted. I could feel the change in the air, the subtle tension that preceded revelation. Then I turned. Edward Langston walked down the center aisle with the quiet authority of a man who'd spent 30 years interpreting the law at its highest levels. He was in his mid-50s, dressed in a dark suit that was impeccable without being showy, his silver hair neatly trimmed. There was nothing flashy about him. No dramatic entrance, no theatrical gestures. He simply walked forward and took a seat directly behind me in the first row of the gallery. Harrison Burke frowned, studying him with narrowed eyes. He didn't recognize Edward. Why would he? Edward had been retired for 5 years, had deliberately kept a low profile during his career, preferring to let his ruling speak rather than seeking publicity. But Judge Weston recognized him. I watched Weston's face from the corner of my eye and saw the exact moment recognition hit. His hand reaching for his water glass froze mid-motion. His eyes widened fractionally, and his lips parted as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he turned to his clerk and said, "Why didn't anyone tell me she was here?" The pronoun was wrong. He meant to say he, but the shock had rattled him. The clerk looked confused, glancing around the courtroom as murmurs rippled through the gallery. Edward simply sat, hands folded in his lap, and gave me the smallest nod. Just the corner of his mouth lifting, and something that might have been a smile. Margaret's smug expression had vanished. She leaned toward Ethan, whispering urgently, but he looked just as confused as everyone else. Only Judge Weston understood what Edward's presence meant. I'd met Edward 3 years ago, during the darkest period of my life. Ethan had just left me, taking Laya with him and filing papers that painted me as dangerous. My architectural license was under review after discrepancies appeared in projects I'd worked on. Discrepancies Ethan had manufactured, using my credentials to funnel money through fake construction contracts. I was drowning, and everyone thought I'd done it to myself. Edward had been reviewing cases for a federal inquiry into construction fraud, unpaid work he did because he believed in justice, and my name appeared in the files. He'd read my testimony, seen the timeline, and recognized the pattern of financial abuse and gaslighting. He'd reached out to me through a mutual connection, met me at a coffee shop, and asked me one question. Do you want justice, or do you want revenge? I told him the truth. I want my sister back, and I want my name cleared. He'd studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Then we'll build a case properly, quietly. And when the time comes, the truth will speak for itself. For 3 years, he'd guided me, teaching me how to gather evidence legally, how to document everything, how to be patient when every instinct screamed to act. He taught me that justice wasn't loud. It was deliberate. And now he was here, and Judge Weston knew that everything was about to change. Ethan's confidence had faltered. He kept glancing back at Edward, trying to understand why the judge looked so unsettled. Harrison Burke cleared his throat. Your Honor, may we continue? Weston blinked, pulled himself together. Yes, of course, Mr. Hale, please continue your testimony. But something had shifted. The judge's questions were sharper now, more probing. When Ethan described my supposed instability, Weston asked for specific dates, concrete examples, documentation beyond the photos and emails. Ethan stumbled over his answers, and I saw the first crack in his facade. Margaret leaned forward, her knuckles white against the gallery railing. She'd built her family's reputation on control and appearances, and she could feel that control slipping away. Michael caught my eye and gave me the slightest nod. The plan was unfolding exactly as we'd designed it. When Ethan finally stepped down from the witness stand, he walked past me and hissed under his breath, "Who is that man?" I looked up at him, my expression serene. So it was a masterful performance. If I hadn't lived through the reality, Margaret's cold dismissal of my concerns, her active participation in isolating me from family and friends, her gleeful reinforcement of every lie Ethan told, I might have believed her myself. Harrison called 2 more character witnesses, both friends of the Hale family, both describing me as unstable, jealous, and vindictive. They painted a picture of a woman spiraling out of control, unable to cope with grief and turning her pain outward toward her innocent husband. I sat through it all, my hands folded in my lap, my breathing steady. Michael had prepared me for this. They'll try to bury you in narrative, he'd said. Let them, because every lie they tell gives us an opening. When the character witnesses finished, Judge Weston turned to Michael. Does the defense wish to cross-examine? No, Your Honor, Michael replied. But we would like to call Clara Monroe to make a statement. Harrison leaped up. Objection. Ms. Monroe is the plaintiff. She can't simply make unstructured statements. I'll allow it, Weston interrupted, his eyes flicking briefly to Edward. But keep it brief, Mr. Trent. I stood and walked to the witness box, my legs steady despite the pounding of my heart. I'd rehearsed this moment 100 times, but now that it was here, the weight of 3 years pressed down on me. I looked at Judge Weston, then at Ethan, then back to the judge. Your Honor, I began, my voice clear. I'm not here to defend my character against accusations. My character will become clear through evidence. But I do have some questions I'd like answered, if the court permits. Weston frowned. This is unusual, Miss Monroe. But proceed. I turned to Ethan, who sat beside his lawyer, his expression guarded. Ethan, do you remember our trip to Montreal 3 years ago in April? His jaw tightened. What does that have to do with— Just answer the question, I said calmly. Yes, we attended a charity gala. The Hale Foundation's annual fundraiser. You told me we'd raised over $200,000 that night for children's hospitals. That's correct, I nodded slowly. And do you remember the donation that disappeared? The one from the Westbrook Group, $50,000, that was supposed to be deposited but never appeared in the foundation's accounts? Ethan's face went pale. Harrison Burke shot to his feet. Objection. This is completely outside the scope of— It's directly relevant, Your Honor, Michael interjected smoothly, standing. If you'll allow us to present documentation. Michael approached the bench with a folder, handing copies to both the judge and Harrison. I watched Ethan's face as his lawyer read the documents, saw the moment comprehension, and panic flashed across his features. Your Honor, Michael said quietly, what appears to be a simple charity gala was actually a front for financial fraud. The Westbrook donation, along with several others, was funneled through Ethan Hale's company and into an offshore account. The charity never saw a penny. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Weston's gavel cracked against the bench. Order! Margaret had gone rigid in her seat, her face ashen. Ethan found his voice. This is ridiculous. Those documents they're falsified. She's making this up. But I could see he was rattled. The careful facade he'd maintained all morning was cracking. We have bank records, email correspondence, and testimony from the Westbrook Group CFO confirming that their donation was rerouted, Michael continued, his voice steady. We also have similar documentation for 3 other charitable events over the past 5 years. Edward, still seated behind me, passed another folder to Michael through the gap in the gallery railing. It was a smooth, practiced motion, barely noticeable. But Judge Weston saw it, and his eyes widened again. Michael opened the new folder. Your Honor, this is a sealed affidavit from the Federal Inquiry into Construction Fraud in the Northeastern District. It names Ethan Hale as a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. The courtroom exploded. Harrison was shouting objections. Margaret was on her feet. And Ethan? He'd gone completely white. Judge Weston's gavel came down repeatedly. Order! I will have order in this courtroom! When the chaos subsided, Weston looked at the affidavit, his hands visibly trembling. He glanced at Edward, then back at the document, and I saw the moment he realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just a custody case. It was a fraud case, a corruption case, a web of lies that stretched back years, and he was now presiding over its unraveling. We'll adjourn early for the day, Weston announced, his voice strained. I need time to review these documents and determine how to proceed. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. As the gavel fell, Ethan pushed past his lawyer and cornered me in the aisle. His face was twisted with rage and fear. Who told you about this? He hissed. I looked up at him, this man who'd tried to destroy me, and felt nothing but cold certainty. You should have treated honesty like an asset, Ethan, I told him, my voice calm. Instead, you invested everything in lies. And now the market's crashed. He stared at me, speechless, then turned and stormed out. Margaret followed, her pearls clicking together as she moved, muttering, This isn't over. This isn't over. But her voice lacked conviction. I gathered my things slowly, aware of the stares from the gallery, the whispered conversations. Edward stood and placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. Just a moment of contact, a gesture of support, before walking out ahead of me. Outside the courtroom, Ava was waiting, her eyes wide. Clara, what just happened in there? I managed a tired smile. The truth. Just a piece of it, but enough to make them afraid. And tomorrow? She asked. I looked back at the courthouse doors, thinking of Laya waiting at the cafe. Thinking of 3 years of careful preparation. Thinking of all the nights I'd wanted to give up but hadn't. Tomorrow, I said, we finish what we started. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, the same apartment I'd moved into after Ethan left. I let myself remember. 3 years ago, I'd been someone different. Clara Hale, married to a man I thought I knew, working at Brennan and Associates as a junior architect on a federal project, a new community center that would serve 3 underserved neighborhoods. I'd been so proud of that work, proud of the difference it would make. I hadn't known that Ethan was using my credentials. The memory surfaced with painful clarity. I'd been reviewing invoices one evening, routine oversight, when I noticed discrepancies. Materials ordered but never delivered. Contractors paid for work that didn't exist. The amounts were small at first, easy to dismiss as clerical errors, but they added up. And they all traced back to my signature. When I confronted Ethan, he'd looked at me with such sincere confusion that I doubted myself immediately. Clara, sweetheart, you've been under so much stress. Are you sure you're reading those correctly? Maybe you should take a break from the project. Let someone else handle the details for a while. But I couldn't let it go. I dug deeper, stayed late at the office, followed the paper trail, and that's when I found it. False construction contracts, shell companies, money moving through channels designed to look legitimate, but existing only to funnel federal funds into private accounts, Ethan's accounts. When I tried to report it, he'd been ready. Somehow he had anticipated my discovery. Within days, the discrepancies were attributed to me. My credentials, my signatures, my supposed incompetence, or worse, my deliberate fraud. No one will believe you, Ethan had said, his voice calm and cold in our kitchen. It was the first time I'd seen the mask drop completely. I've been building this for 2 years, Clara. Every piece of evidence points to you. If you try to expose me, you'll only destroy yourself. And Laya? His smile had been cruel. Laya will be fine with me, where she'll be safe from her unstable criminal sister. That was the moment I realized I was trapped. If I reported the fraud, I'd lose my career and potentially my freedom. If I stayed silent, Ethan would continue stealing, and I'd be complicit. So I'd done the only thing I could. I started gathering evidence of my own, quietly, carefully. And then Edward Langston had found me. I rolled over in bed, looking at the photograph on my nightstand. Laya and me at her 8th grade graduation, both of us smiling. I'd raised her since she was 7. Through grief and adjustment and adolescence, she was my sister. But in every way that mattered, she was my daughter. I couldn't let Ethan take her. My phone buzzed. A text from Edward. Rest. Tomorrow requires clarity, not exhaustion. I smiled despite myself. He'd become more than a mentor over these 3 years. He'd become the father figure I'd lost. The steady presence that reminded me I wasn't alone. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse to find reporters lingering in the hallway. News had leaked somehow, probably from the courtroom observers, that the Hale custody case involved federal fraud allegations. Cameras flashed as I walked past, but I kept my expression neutral, my pace steady. Edward was waiting inside, and this time he spoke to me directly before we entered the courtroom. "They'll try to corner you emotionally today," he said, his voice low. "Burke will paint you as vindictive, as a woman scorned, seeking revenge through false accusations. Don't let them." "I won't." "And Clara," he met my eyes, "what you're doing here, it's not just about winning. It's about reclaiming yourself. Remember that." I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Ethan looked haggard, like he hadn't slept. Margaret sat beside him, her usual composure cracked, her eyes darting around the room with something close to fear. Harrison Burke, however, looked energized. He'd spent the night strategizing, and I could see it in the set of his jaw, the way he organized his papers with renewed purpose. He thought he'd found an angle. When court convened, he wasted no time. "Your Honor, the defense moves to have Edward Langston's testimony, or rather his presence and any documents he's provided, disqualified on grounds of personal bias." Michael stood immediately. "Mr. Langston hasn't testified, Your Honor. He's simply observing." "His mere presence is prejudicial," Harrison argued. "He has a clear personal relationship with Ms. Monroe, has been advising her for years, according to her own admission yesterday. And his former position as a federal judge creates an implicit bias in favor of her claims." Judge Weston rubbed his temples. I could see the conflict playing across his face, professional respect for Edward warring with the procedural concerns Burke was raising. "Mr. Langston," Weston said finally, "would you approach the bench?" Edward stood and walked forward with that same quiet authority. The two men spoke in low tones for several minutes, and I watched Weston's expression shift from skepticism to something else. Shame, perhaps. Or recognition. When Edward returned to his seat, Weston announced, "Mr. Langston's presence will be allowed. He has not testified and has provided documents through proper legal channels via Ms. Monroe's attorney. The objection is overruled." Harrison looked furious but sat down. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until later, was what Edward had said to Judge Weston in that moment. He'd asked Weston a simple question. Would you have treated her fairly if you'd known from the start who she was? And Weston, to his credit, had recognized the uncomfortable truth in that question. The day proceeded with testimony from forensic accountants who'd reviewed the Hale Foundation's records. The evidence was damning: years of financial irregularities, donations that vanished, money laundered through legitimate charitable work. Ethan tried to claim ignorance, but the email trail told a different story. Messages in his own words, directing transfers, discussing strategies to make the numbers work, coordinating with others involved in the scheme. By midday, even Margaret looked defeated. Ethan arrived looking worse than yesterday. His suit was immaculate, as always, but there were shadows under his eyes, and his confident swagger had been replaced by something tighter, more defensive. He avoided looking at me completely, which told me more than any confrontation could have. He was afraid. Margaret walked beside him, her face set in hard lines. Gone was the concerned grandmother act. Now she just looked angry, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath her skin. Edward was already in the courtroom when I entered, seated in his usual spot in the first row of the gallery. His presence had become a touchstone for me. Every time doubt crept in, I'd glance back and see him there, steady and certain. He gave me a small nod as I took my seat beside Michael. "Ready?" Michael asked quietly. I nodded. We'd spent last night preparing for today's session. Michael had explained that we were reaching the critical point where evidence would either coalesce into undeniable truth or fragment into reasonable doubt. "They're going to fight hard today," he'd warned. "Burke knows this is his last chance to control the narrative." Judge Weston entered, and I studied his face as he settled into his chair. He looked like he'd aged years in the past few days. There was a heaviness to his movements, a reluctance that hadn't been there at the start of the trial. He called the court to order, and Harrison Burke immediately requested to speak. "Your Honor, the defense would like to reopen proceedings with a motion to dismiss the financial allegations as irrelevant to the custody matter at hand." "Denied," Weston said so quickly that Burke blinked in surprise. "The financial improprieties go directly to character and fitness as a guardian. Continue with your case, Mr. Burke." Burke's jaw tightened, but he nodded. When he stood to address the court, his tone was more aggressive than I'd heard before. "Your Honor, what we're witnessing is a classic case of a vindictive woman using emotional manipulation and theatrical accusations to destroy a man's reputation. Clara Monroe is not here seeking justice. She's seeking revenge." The words hit like they were meant to, sharp and accusatory. I felt Ava tense beside me in the gallery, but I kept my breathing steady. "Objection." Michael's voice was calm but firm. "Counsel is making unfounded accusations without evidence. If he has proof that any evidence was manufactured, he should present it." "Sustained," Weston said. "Mr. Burke, stick to provable facts." Burke's face flushed, but he pressed on. "Then let's talk about facts. We'd like to submit new evidence, courtesy of a more thorough investigation into Ms. Monroe's activities over the past 3 years. My stomach dropped. What had they found? Burke approached the bench with a file, and Michael stood immediately to review it. I watched my attorney's face as he read, looking for any sign of concern, but his expression remained neutral. After a moment, Michael looked up. "Your Honor, we'd also like to submit new evidence. Audio recordings obtained legally through Mr. Langston's federal inquiry connections." He pulled a small device from his briefcase, and suddenly the courtroom fell silent with anticipation. "These are recordings of phone conversations between Ethan Hale and several business associates discussing the creation of false documentation and witness coaching." Burke shot to his feet. "Objection. Where did these recordings come from?" "How do we know they're authentic?" "They came from a federal wiretap authorized during the construction fraud investigation," Michael replied calmly. They've been authenticated by federal forensic analysts. I have their reports here. Weston held up a hand. I want both sets of evidence submitted for my review. We'll take a short recess while I examine them. As the judge disappeared into his chambers, the courtroom erupted into frantic whispers. Ethan leaned toward Burke, speaking urgently, his face pale. Margaret had her hand on his arm, squeezing so hard her knuckles were white. I turned to look at Edward, and he mouthed 2 words. Stay calm. The recess felt endless. Ava brought me water that I couldn't drink. My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. Everything hinged on what happened next. Whether the judge would allow the recordings, whether Burke's counter-evidence would undermine our case. When we reconvened 20 minutes later, Judge Weston looked grim. Mr. Burke's evidence consists of testimony from 3 individuals claiming Ms. Monroe contacted them, seeking false testimony against Mr. Hale. However, he paused, his voice hardening. 2 of those individuals have financial ties to Hale Construction, and the 3rd is currently under investigation for perjury in an unrelated case. I'm excluding this evidence as unreliable. Burke's face went red. Your Honor. However, Weston continued, Mr. Trent's audio evidence has been authenticated. I'm allowing it to be presented. The courtroom exploded with noise. Reporters in the gallery were frantically taking notes. Margaret looked like she might be sick. Michael played the first recording. Ethan's voice filled the courtroom, tinny but unmistakable. Just stick to what we discussed. Clara was erratic, unstable. You witnessed arguments. Keep it vague enough that she can't disprove specifics. Another voice, male, uncertain. I don't know, Ethan. If this comes out, it won't. Trust me, I've covered every angle. The second recording was worse. Ethan discussing how to massage the financial records to hide the charitable fraud, mentioning me specifically. The best part is, even if Clara figures it out, she's already been discredited. No one will believe her. I watched Ethan as the recordings played. His face had gone from pale to ashen, and his hands were shaking. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse, because it was. When the recordings ended, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Then Judge Weston spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Mr. Hale, would you care to explain these recordings? Ethan stood slowly, and I saw him struggling to find his footing, to locate the charm and confidence that had always been his shield. Your Honor, those conversations, they're taken out of context. I was speaking hypothetically, discussing worst-case scenarios with— You were coaching witnesses to lie, Weston interrupted coldly. You were conspiring to commit perjury in my courtroom. No. Sit down, Mr. Hale. Ethan sat, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked truly defeated. Burke tried to salvage something. Your Honor, while these recordings are concerning, they don't change the fundamental question of custody. And they change everything, Mr. Burke, Weston said. They speak directly to your client's character, his honesty, and his fitness as a guardian. I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been wound tight for 3 years. This was happening. The truth was finally breaking through. During the lunch recess, Ethan cornered me in the hallway outside the restrooms. His face was twisted with desperation and rage. You think you've won? He hissed. You think this is over? I met his eyes steadily. I think you built your lies like glass walls, Ethan, I said, and they're cracking. Everything I did for us. The money, the opportunities. I was building a future. You were building a prison, I said quietly. And the only person you've trapped is yourself. He stared at me, and I saw the moment something broke in him, the last vestige of his self-delusion shattering. Then he turned and walked away, shoulders hunched, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. When the afternoon session began, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Even Burke seemed to have lost his fighting spirit, going through motions more than mounting a defense. Michael presented testimony from Colin Vance, Ethan's former business partner, who detailed the fraud scheme in devastating clarity. The charitable foundations, the construction contracts, the offshore accounts, all of it laid bare. Margaret sat frozen in the gallery, tears streaming silently down her face. The family reputation she'd guarded so fiercely was being destroyed in real time. As the day drew to a close, Judge Weston announced, "We'll reconvene tomorrow for final arguments and my decision. Until then, court is adjourned." Outside, the October evening air felt crisp and clean. I stood on the courthouse steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Ava came to stand beside me. You okay? I nodded slowly. I keep waiting to feel vindicated, but mostly I just feel tired. That's because you're not doing this for revenge, she said. You're doing it for Leia and for yourself. Edward approached from behind, his voice gentle. Whatever happens tomorrow, Clara, you've already accomplished something remarkable. You refuse to let him erase you. I turned to look at him, this man who'd given me the tools to rebuild myself. Thank you for everything. He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. I didn't do anything except believe what was already true, that you were stronger than your circumstances. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed. A text from Leia, is it over yet? I typed back. Almost, sweetheart. Almost. That night I barely slept again. But this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the strange, unfamiliar feeling of hope, fragile as glass, but growing stronger with every breath. Judge Daniel Weston sat alone in his chambers long after everyone else had left the courthouse. The building was silent, except for the distant hum of cleaning equipment and the occasional echo of footsteps in the hallway. I wouldn't learn about this until later, but Edward told me what happened that night. How Weston had pulled out old case files, going back through years of decisions, looking for the one case that had haunted him since Clara Monroe had walked into his courtroom. He found it, buried in a stack from 3 years ago, a preliminary complaint filed by Clara Brennan, her married name then, regarding financial discrepancies at Brennan and Associates. The report was thorough, detailed, clearly written by someone who understood architecture and construction finance. Weston had dismissed it with barely a glance. Insufficient evidence to warrant federal review, his notes read. He passed it back to the state level, where it had disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. If he'd read it properly, if he'd paid attention to the patterns Clara had identified, the entire fraud scheme might have been stopped years ago. Leia might never have been taken from her sister. Clara's reputation might never have been destroyed. And Weston would have to live with that knowledge. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse to find the media presence had tripled. News vans lined the street. Reporters doing stand-ups on the steps, cameras everywhere. The Hale family scandal had become a full-blown spectacle. I kept my head down, ignored the shouted questions, and made my way inside. Edward was waiting in our usual spot, and when I sat down beside Michael, I felt the weight of the final day settle over me. This was it. Today would determine everything. Ethan looked hollow when he entered, like someone had scooped out everything inside him and left only a shell. Margaret wasn't with him. I learned later that she'd suffered a breakdown the previous evening and was under sedation at home. Judge Weston entered, and I studied his face carefully. There was something different about him today. A set to his jaw, a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Before we begin final arguments, he said, his voice formal, I need to address something. Mr. Langston, would you approach the bench? Edward stood and walked forward. The two men spoke in low tones for several minutes, and I saw Weston's expression shift through several emotions: shame, resignation, determination. When Edward returned to his seat, Weston turned to address the court. I want to state for the record that I have a personal connection to this case that I was not initially aware of. 3 years ago, I reviewed a preliminary complaint filed by Ms. Monroe, then Miss Brennan, regarding financial irregularities. I dismissed that complaint without proper investigation. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Burke looked stunned. I have consulted with Mr. Langston and with the State Ethics Board, Weston continued. And while there is no legal requirement for me to recuse myself, I want to acknowledge this conflict openly. My failure 3 years ago does not excuse itself, but I am committed to ensuring that justice is served in this courtroom today. I felt tears prick my eyes. This public admission, this acknowledgement of his mistake, was something I never expected. Burke stood shakily. Your Honor, if you have a conflict... I am not recusing myself, Mr. Burke, Weston said firmly. I am simply being transparent. Now shall we proceed with closing arguments? Burke's closing was weak, grasping at straws. He tried to paint Ethan as a flawed but caring man who'd made mistakes, who deserved a chance at redemption, who loved his family. But the words rang hollow in light of everything that had been revealed. When Michael stood for our closing, he was eloquent and precise. Your Honor, this case began as a custody battle. But what it has revealed is a systematic campaign of fraud, manipulation, and abuse. Ethan Hale didn't just steal money. He stole Clara Monroe's reputation, her career, and very nearly her sister. He tried to erase her. Michael turned to look at me, and I felt the weight of his next words before he spoke them. But Clara refused to be erased. She spent 3 years building a case, not out of vengeance, but out of love. Love for her sister, love for truth, and ultimately love for the person she refused to let Ethan destroy, herself. The courtroom was absolutely silent. The question before this court is simple, Michael concluded. Who should raise Leah Monroe? A man who has been proven to lie, steal, and manipulate? Or the woman who raised her with integrity, even while her own world was falling apart? He sat down and Judge Weston nodded slowly. I'll need time to deliberate. Court is adjourned until 2 p.m. Those 3 hours were the longest of my life. Ava and I sat in a small cafe 2 blocks away, neither of us able to eat. Edward had excused himself, saying he needed to make some calls, but I suspected he just wanted to give me space. My phone rang. It was Leah. Clara? Her voice was small, frightened. What's happening? The judge is deciding, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. We'll know soon. I want to come home, she whispered. I want to be with you. Soon, sweetheart. I promise. When we returned to the courthouse at 2 p.m., the courtroom was packed. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls. The air felt electric with anticipation. Judge Weston entered carrying a folder. His face was grave, unreadable. I've reviewed all the evidence presented in this case, he began. And I've had to confront some uncomfortable truths about the parties involved, about the systems we trust, and about my own failures. He paused, looking directly at me. Miss Monroe, 3 years ago, you came to the justice system seeking help, and the justice system failed you. I failed you. I dismissed your complaint without proper consideration, and in doing so, I allowed the fraud and abuse to continue. My breath caught. But you didn't let that failure define you. You built your case carefully, legally, with patience and determination. You proved that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still prevail. He opened the folder. In the matter of custody of Leah Monroe, I am granting full legal guardianship to Claire Monroe, effective immediately. The courtroom exploded. I heard Ava cry out behind me, felt Michael's hand on my shoulder, but I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. I'd won. Leah was coming home. Furthermore, Weston continued, his voice cutting through the noise, I am referring Ethan Hale's case to federal prosecutors for criminal charges of fraud, perjury, and falsification of documents. Mr. Hale, you will surrender yourself to federal custody within 24 hours. Ethan didn't move. He just sat there staring at nothing, completely broken. Mr. Burke, Weston added, I strongly suggest you resign from this case before you face potential charges as an accessory. Burke gathered his papers with shaking hands and left without another word. As the gavel fell, I finally allowed myself to cry. 3 years of held-back tears. 3 years of pain and fear and desperate hope, all flooding out at once. The aftermath was chaos. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, shouting questions. Federal marshals entered to take custody of Ethan, though they'd granted him the 24 hours to turn himself in. I pushed through it all, Ava on one side, Michael on the other, until I reached the street where my car was parked. And there, leaning against a lamppost, was Leah. She saw me and ran. We collided in the middle of the sidewalk, and I held her tighter than I'd ever held anyone, feeling her sobs against my shoulder. I'm sorry, she kept saying. I'm so sorry I couldn't stop him. Shh, sweetheart. None of this was your fault. None of it. We stood there for a long time, just holding each other while the world moved around us. That evening, back in my apartment, our apartment now, Leah and I sat on the couch eating takeout Chinese food. Everything felt surreal, like I might wake up and find it had all been a dream. What happens to Ethan? Leah asked quietly. I considered how to answer. She was 15, old enough for truth. He'll go to trial for the fraud. He'll probably go to prison. She nodded slowly. Good, I know that sounds terrible, but good. It doesn't sound terrible, I said. It sounds honest. We ate in comfortable silence for a while. Then Leah spoke again. I knew you'd come for me. Even when he said you were crazy, that you'd given up. I knew you wouldn't. I could never give up on you, Leah. Never. Over the next few days, the full extent of the Hale family's fall became clear. Federal investigators raided Hale Construction's offices and the Hale Foundation headquarters. Bank accounts were frozen. Business partners were being questioned. Margaret Hale, still under sedation, was reportedly being investigated for her role in the fraud scheme. Several of their society friends were implicated as well. People who'd participated in the fake charitable galas, who'd helped launder money, who'd looked the other way for years. The family name that Margaret had guarded so fiercely was now synonymous with corruption and fraud. I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, just a quiet, tired relief that it was over. A week after the verdict, Edward invited me to lunch at a small Italian restaurant downtown. We sat in a corner booth and he ordered wine, even though it was barely noon. "You're celebrating," I observed. "We're celebrating," he corrected. "You did something remarkable, Clara. I had help. I couldn't have done any of it without you." He shook his head. "I gave you tools. You did the work. All those late nights gathering evidence, maintaining your composure under impossible pressure, never letting anger or revenge cloud your judgment. That was all you. Why did you help me?" I asked suddenly. "Really? You'd been retired for years. You could have ignored my case like everyone else did." Edward was quiet for a moment, swirling his wine. 20 years ago, my daughter was in an abusive marriage. She tried to leave, tried to get help, but her husband was wealthy, connected. Every door she turned to closed in her face. By the time anyone believed her, it was too late. My breath caught. "I'm so sorry." "She survived," he said quietly. "But it changed her. Broke something in her that never fully healed. When I read your case file, I saw the same pattern. A woman telling the truth, a system failing to listen. And I thought, maybe I could help this time. Maybe I could prevent what happened to my daughter from happening to you." "You did," I whispered. "You saved me." "No," he said firmly. "You saved yourself. I just reminded you that you could." We sat in comfortable silence, and I realized that justice wasn't just about courtrooms and verdicts. It was about people believing you when you told the truth. It was about having someone in your corner when the whole world seemed against you. It was about refusing to be erased. 3 months later, I stood in a different courtroom, this time as a witness in Ethan's criminal trial. The federal prosecutors had built an airtight case using the evidence we'd gathered, plus additional findings from their investigation. Ethan had aged dramatically. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and he'd lost weight. He looked nothing like the confident man who'd walked up the courthouse steps that October morning. When I took the stand, he finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine remorse. "Ms. Monroe," the prosecutor said, "can you describe what happened when you first discovered the fraud?" I told the truth, all of it. The discovery, the gaslighting, the threats, the years of carefully building my case while pretending to be broken. When the defense attorney cross-examined me, he tried to paint me as vindictive, but I just answered honestly, without emotion, and eventually he gave up. Ethan was convicted on 14 counts of fraud, perjury, and racketeering. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Margaret Hale accepted a plea deal, 3 years probation and community service in exchange for testimony against her son's business partners. She'd lost everything, her social standing, her wealth, her family's reputation. I heard she moved to Florida to live with a cousin, too ashamed to show her face in our city anymore. As for me, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. My architectural license was reinstated after an ethics board review cleared me of all wrongdoing. I started taking freelance projects, slowly rebuilding my career. Laya thrived. She made new friends, joined the drama club at school, started talking about college. Watching her heal was the greatest reward of everything I'd been through. One afternoon in January, 6 months after the verdict, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Judge Daniel Weston stood in my doorway looking uncertain. "Ms. Monroe, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Your Honor." "Please, come in." He sat across from my desk, and I could see the weight he still carried. "I wanted to apologize properly," he said, "in private, without the courtroom theatrics. What I did 3 years ago dismissing your complaint. It was careless and arrogant. I thought I knew better without even reading your evidence properly, and you paid the price for my laziness." "You've already apologized," I said gently. "Words in a courtroom aren't enough." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "I've written a letter to the State Ethics Board recommending mandatory review procedures for all preliminary complaints. I've also endowed a legal fund in your name to help other people in situations like yours who need legal help but can't afford it." Tears sprang to my eyes. "Judge Weston," "Daniel," he said. "Please, Daniel." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Because that morning when I saw Edward sitting behind you in my courtroom, I realized something. I'd been so focused on reputation and protocol that I'd forgotten what justice actually means. Edward reminded me. You reminded me? What did he say to you? I asked. That first morning when you whispered, "Why didn't anyone tell me she was here?" Daniel smiled sadly. When I saw Edward, I knew immediately that something important was happening. I'd dismissed a case connected to his federal inquiry years ago, your case, though I didn't realize it at the time. And I knew if Edward was there, it meant I'd made a terrible mistake. That's when I whispered to my clerk, confused about why no one had warned me. Of course, no one could have warned me because I'd failed to make the connection myself. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. You know what Edward told me during that first recess? He asked me one question. Would you have treated her fairly if you'd known from the start who she was? And the honest answer terrified me. I didn't know. I'd built my reputation on being fair, but I'd become lazy, complacent. You reminded me what's at stake every time I put on that robe. After he left, I sat at my desk for a long time, thinking about justice and redemption and second chances. That evening, I picked Leia up from drama rehearsal and we drove home through the city lights. She was chattering about her role in the spring play, and I listened, letting her happiness wash over me. When we got home, I found a small package on our doorstep. Inside was a brass plaque, beautifully engraved, with a note from Edward. For your desk. Remember what you've proven. The plaque read, Justice isn't loud. It's deliberate. I carried it inside and placed it on my desk where I could see it every day. A reminder of what I'd survived, what I'd fought for, and who I'd become. Leia appeared in the doorway of my office. What's that? A reminder, I said, that we're stronger than our circumstances. She came to stand beside me reading the inscription. Then she hugged me tight. I'm proud of you, Clara, for never giving up. I'm proud of us, I corrected, for surviving. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Ethan in prison, Margaret in exile, and the empire of lies that had crumbled. I thought about Judge Weston's apology, and Edward's quiet mentorship, and Michael's steady support. But mostly I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, drowning, desperate, doubted by everyone, including herself. And the woman I'd become, steady, certain, unbreakable. Ethan had tried to bury me. He tried to erase me from my own life, to paint me as crazy and broken and worthless. Instead, I'd built my own foundation, brick by brick, piece of evidence by piece of evidence, day by day. And when the time came to stand on it, it held. I'd learned that justice wasn't about being loud. It wasn't about revenge or anger or even vindication. It was about being deliberate, about telling the truth quietly, consistently, without wavering, about believing in yourself even when no one else did. And in the end, that quiet persistence had been stronger than all of Ethan's lies. I fell asleep that night with Leia safe in the room next door, with my name cleared and my career restored, with the brass plaque sitting on my desk and the weight of 3 years finally lifted from my shoulders. I fell asleep finally truly, completely free. And in the morning, I would wake up and build something new. If you've ever been dismissed, doubted, or felt like your truth didn't matter, what did you build in the silence while they underestimated you? Tell me your story in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to hear what you have to say. Thanks for watching. Take care. Good luck.